Delighted to be, well, let me start over again. I didn't wait long enough. I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. I'm so delighted to see all of you today and talk about therapy. I've been a clinical psychologist since 1993, actually, and in practice since then. And I hope that I've learned how to do some good therapy. I know I've done some not so good therapy, but I've tried. A little bit about me. I've been in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I got my training in Dallas, Texas at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School. And I've been here in Fayetteville again since 1993. And I've been with the Mighty for the last 4 years. Monthly, we've been doing something. Hello, Layla. Oh, you love the Mighty? I do too. I do too. They have such a place in the website forum spectrum, however you want to say. Therapy's helped you with I am a therapist because I got good therapy, okay? And I'm doing fine. Thanks, Cherise. Actually, this is my birthday. So, I've had a very nice day. I had way too much lunch, but it was delicious. And so I've been looking forward to being with all y'all today here. But anyway, I have been with the Mighty for 4 years, fairly regularly on Wednesdays, third Wednesdays at this point, and I have absolutely loved doing it. I've gotten to know so many of you. Some of you, thank you, Tricia. So many of you have either joined my Facebook closed group at facebook.com/groups/selfwork, or you have gotten on the podcast, or you've just emailed me or something and let me know that you have enjoyed what I have to offer at the Mighty. So what I have today to talk about is therapy. Thank you to all of you. It has been a great day so far. My husband actually didn't have anything planned, and hi, Michelle. And he didn't have anything planned, but he's just like that. He gets kind of paralyzed around special events. He's a very, very thoughtful person, and then he gets just kind of overwhelmed when it's like Christmas or birthday or something. So there's a package down there for me that I think he went and got this morning. So he was a little ashamed of himself, I think. So we'll have some fun tonight when he gets home. And I've been at home working all day. So anyway, we're going to be talking about therapy, and there are lots of different kinds of therapy. And so that does make our discussion a little more complex than it might be if there was just one way of doing therapy, because there are many, many ways of doing therapy, and so many ways that some of the times people will write to me and say, well, what do you know about, and they'll name these 3 letters, and I don't know what it is. I try to go to seminars, of course, and keep up on what's going on. But I would say that my style of therapy is very, I use sort of a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, family systems therapy, and Margaret Rutherford therapy, because I developed a style over time. And I think that it is something that as a therapist you find your niche, and there are people who are drawn to that. There are people who fit very well into that. And then I'm not everybody's cup of tea either, the way I happen to approach therapy and approach my own clients or patients. So we want you to talk about what therapy has been like for you. How did you know it was working? How did you know it wasn't working? Again, and I think that has to do with the therapist style. And you may not even know your therapist style. So that's a good question to ask. But let's first start about okay, here we go. Here's one. Do you know anything about BWRT? I have no clue what BWRT means. So if you would let me know, if you'd spell that out for me, perhaps I could talk to you about that, but I don't know what that is. But therapy, basically, so many people will say to me, well, now I don't know how to pick a therapist because it just seems like it's a shot in the dark. Any good therapist, any therapist that's living in the 21st century is going to have a website. And of course, you can look at their website, you can see how they talk about the work they do, what they focus on. Certainly on my website at drmargaretrutherford.com, I don't have I have an about page. I don't talk about therapy necessarily, but my particular website is not geared toward trying to get more clients. I'm, knock on wood, as full as I can be. So, but most therapists' websites are. They will say, I tend to see people with anxiety or depression or trauma, or I do EMDR, or I do cognitive behavioral work. Or they will explain what they do and their training. But feel sure or be sure that you could always call them and ask to talk to them for a few minutes before committing to a session. Let me look at this. Let me see. I wasn't sure about my therapist, so I consulted with another therapist to see if my therapist was the right one for me. Oh, another therapist. Yeah, that's great. Good for you, Michelle. Ask around. For example, I'll use myself as an example because I know more about me. I'm known as a pretty direct, probably fairly solution-oriented kind of therapist. I do see people for long periods of time sometimes, but I'm more, let's get you moving. One of my favorite sayings is, my job is to do myself out of a job. Brain working recursive therapy. No, that may be something like brain spotting. I do know a tiny bit about that. But Ted, I will get back to that and talk about some of the newer techniques. And they were definitely neurologically inclined or neurophysiologically inclined. But if someone called me, for example, and said, so, Dr. Rutherford, do you do sort of long-term dynamically oriented therapy? I would say, no, I do not. I'm not the therapist for you. If you want to kind of peruse your childhood or your life and do it in a very organic way, you're going to come in front of me and I'm going to say, well, what'd you think about the last session? I'm very interactive. And there are other therapists that are not. So you really have to say, do you have an interactive style? Do you have a more laid back style? Do you let me do the sessions? I mean, do you control the sessions? Do I? So you can ask all those kinds of questions. You do have to find, Cheryl says, sometimes you need to find the right therapist. I will tell you that the meta-analyses show, and that's a fancy word for, they look over a whole bunch of studies trying to find out what are the threads within those studies that show there are commonalities in what works. Every one of them for many years. I don't care. I learned this in graduate school 35 years ago, 30 years ago. I see the same thing now. It is the relationship. It is your belief that the therapist knows what they're doing and they do it consistently. That gives you trust in your therapist, and you're much more likely to reach the goals that you have if you have that kind of relationship with your therapist. We're going to talk a lot more about what to expect from your therapist. I actually, if you want to subscribe to my website, I do have a free ebook. I just thought about it. I wrote it quite a while ago, and it's What is Good Therapy is the name of it. And I took Jeff Foxworthy. I don't know how many of you know him. He's an older Southern comedian, and his famous thing was, you're a redneck if. So I say, you're getting good therapy if, you're getting bad therapy if. And so some of those things are very, very obvious, and some are not. Let's talk about that. Again, we're sort of talking about how to pick a good therapist. Yeah, let's talk about that. So you should have no relationship outside of therapy. When I'm asked to be on committees to raise money for things, I will look at them and say, well, I'm a terrible person to pick for that, because I cannot give you any of the names of my people that I see, whether they have money to give or they don't. That is a sacrosanct, a confidential relationship. And I'm not going to go play golf with them. If I see them in a restaurant, I will sort of nod and just walk on. If they come over to me or they say hello to me, I'll say hello. But you do not have any other kind of relationship with your therapist. Now, are there some times that, like, my friends will want to come to me? That has occasionally happened. I will tell you, it's never worked. So it's just better to have that one way, very, very special therapist relationship, because a therapeutic relationship is like no other, because it is objective about you and it is only about you. That you are not, it is not a give and take relationship, and that's something to also stress. You should know what to expect in therapy. You should know what every therapy session costs. You should know how long it's going to be. I've had people tell me that sometimes they go to a therapist and it's a 45-minute session, and sometimes it'll last an hour and 20 minutes, and they never know, and they don't really even get a bill for months. That is terrible business practice, and it's also unethical. You're not, obviously, you don't get taken to a special room in the back and be given a glass of wine. I mean, that's grooming you for something that is probably sexual abuse is on its way. So you want to be seen in the same room as everybody else. You want to get the same treatment as everybody else. The therapist shouldn't get phone calls during the session. I've had people tell me that their cell phone rings and they pick it up and they're like, make another appointment for another person. No, that time is, you're paying for it and that's yours. And they should be on time. If your therapist is late, that's showing you if you're late, that's not good. But if your therapist is late, then, those are just some basic kinds of things. Now, a lot of times people who become therapists aren't great business people. They're more creative and compassionate, empathic. And so, sometimes you have to be careful that, you're getting a therapist that really does have that. Either they have a business manager that handles that for them, or they at least are able to have a grasp on it themselves. Okay, I can see we're kind of getting into a conversation about something about disabilities, which I know nothing. I do know something about it, but not anything about it where I could lead a discussion. So if we could try to keep the questions or the comments more based on therapy, what it's meant to you, what works. Santiago, sometimes after some months, you seem to get stuck in saying the same thing session after session. Yes, that can happen. If it does happen, what I will say, because I'm a more direct therapist, I'll say, the last 3 sessions have been kind of repetitive. What's going on? Let me understand. I mean, would you like me to lead you more? Would you like me to ask you more questions? Are you struggling outside of here to work on the things that we've talked about? Because, although sessions obviously have one session builds on another. If you find yourself kind of, you're repetitive or the therapist is repetitive, then you're not moving forward or at least moving in some direction. So I will say something about it, or I certainly would empower you to say something about it, to say to the therapist, you seem to ask me the same questions over and over again, and I don't know what to do with that, but I don't like it. It feels as if maybe you're not listening, or you don't quite know what to do yourself. I will tell you, there are some therapists, for example, who don't know how to do really good trauma work. It's not in their skill set. Maybe they can do something else very, very well, but when they get into trauma or sexual abuse or PTSD kinds of things, they do not know what they're doing. And so they will tend to kind of ask you the same questions. But again, if that's you doing that, then either it's time to take a break and you kind of use therapy all you can, or you really need to look at, am I doing the work outside of the therapy session to where I have some new information to bring in? Nothing is ever too small to talk about in therapy. Someone will sit down on the sofa and say, well, I don't know much of, this isn't a big deal, but I did blah, blah, blah. And I go, wait, that's huge. When I first met you, there's no way you could have done that. And so you really don't, no matter how small or large, you want to be able to talk about what you risked, what you thought about that you hadn't thought about, what you noticed that you hadn't noticed, because all of that is good information for your therapist. Okay, so what do you think about distress tolerance work? Well, if I'm understanding that term correctly and what you mean by that, and I may not, because I can think about distress tolerance with anxiety. I can think about it with trauma. I can think about it with PTSD or CPTSD. I think basically that skill is how to understand what your skills and to build your skills about being stressed out, for being triggered, and not allowing yourself to go down that rabbit hole, to use different techniques. You can use grounding techniques, you can use breathing techniques, you can use certainly just thoughts about, how you're filtering that information. You can even identify your own triggers and say, oh, this is an example of this trigger where you objectify it. If that's what you mean, I think it's wonderful. We live in a very stressful world. Do we all now, with the pandemic constantly in the background? And so learning how to tolerate and kind of manage your stress level and your distress level is very, very important. So yes, I think it's wonderful, whether you do it in an emotional kind of setting, in an EFT setting, emotionally focused therapy setting, if you do it in CBT, DBT, all of that's really good. So Ted says, now I have a therapist and group therapy, which has worked for me so far. Yes, I think that's wonderful. I've done a couple of groups in the past. Gosh, I really loved doing groups. And what I like about groups, and actually I've been in a couple of groups as the client, I like it because you do get lots of people's perspective on how you present yourself, on how you come across emotionally and rationally or irrationally, and everybody is in the same boat you are, and so you're being kind, but you also sometimes get gently confronted. And then you have the therapist running the group who also can see the different dynamics of each one of you, and you can say things like, when person A starts talking, you seem to feel more, you give out lots of nonverbal signals that you're not listening. And so what's going on? You actually can do a lot of dynamic work by looking at the interplay between personalities in the group. And then your own individual therapist is there to process that and then actually also work on what you're working on just in that therapy setting. Okay, what is DBT? DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. It was created for people who struggle with borderline personality disorder. That's how it was originally intended, although it has been stretched and morphed into some other things. And it is an offshoot of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and it is all about really trying to get your emotions, again, to use that word, tolerable. It's about emotional regulation, basically. And so what that means is that you are noting emotions, but you don't necessarily act on them. Okay, so you can become afraid, you can become sad, you can become angry, and you are aware of that anger, but you use these tools. And I like DBT tools because they are, they're very, they're not cute, but they are simply shown or demonstrated. And I think that can really help people, because when you're stressed, it's easier to remember like a word like dear man, which is one of their techniques, versus then you go, okay, what's the D, what's the E, what's the A, what's the R? And it's easier than that to remember something complicated that you're trying to hold on to. So obviously that's really important. DBT is excellent, actually, for probably all of us. Bobby, what's your opinion on kids being prescribed an upper for ADHD? Well, if they have ADHD, it's not an upper. Okay. If they have true ADHD, that's not the way it affects them. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, so I've got to be careful here. I'm a PhD, not an MD. But if you're given something like Adderall or one of the others, then that actually calms them down. Their wiring is different. Neurological wiring is different. Don't ask me how. But that does not affect them that way. If I took it, I would be jumping off the walls. So, and sometimes, of course, students take it who are signing, who are studying for an exam and they haven't studied enough, and so they want to stay up all night, so they take Adderall. It also has a lot of potent physical side effects that are not good. So, but if there are a lot of people who are against giving their children any kind of medication, and that's certainly your right as a parent, but I have seen it do incredible good, both for children and adults. Michelle, how do you not become too dependent on your therapist? Great question. We've been talking about this, or at least alluding to it, in the Facebook group I just told y'all about. I'm going to answer this in kind of a stage-like way. I think there is a stage in therapy. I know that I felt this with my therapist. There is a stage in therapy, especially if you've had trauma in your background. And so a lot of the work is about the therapist helping you work through that trauma, and you have to trust them immensely for them to do that work with you. And often you can actually, no, I don't want to say regress, but because your emotions are so intense, you can cry a lot in front of them. You can go numb. You can have a lot of strong psychological reactions where they are really, the word for it is containment. As a therapist, the therapist is helping you contain emotions that seem intolerable or seem like they might tear you apart if you felt them, or even just the memories of experiences. So as a therapist helps you contain that, then that sense of, this is where I'm safe. I'm not safe anywhere else, but I am safe here. That's going to feel like dependence. Okay. Some of that can also occur if the therapy is another way around, where you were the sort of parent in your family, or you've been the star of your family, and you really, you need to be understood in a different way. Maybe you don't have trauma necessarily, but you have family situations that were very damaging. And so the therapist becomes someone that you can really count on to help you understand, in sometimes a very dramatic way, how you've been thinking and what roles you've been having in life, that you're still using some of your childhood strategies. And so they can be, that it can feel like they are witness to you learning about that. And again, you can feel like the only place I'm safe is here. What happens in good therapy, or in therapy when you are ready, and that can vary immensely between people, is that the therapist begins to say, what you experience with me in here, I want you to try to experience with someone else out in your real world. And part of the therapy becomes, now this is probably not so true in psychodynamic therapy, but I'm not a psychodynamic therapist, so my hand might get slapped or my wrist might get slapped by somebody who would say, oh yeah, we do that. So maybe I shouldn't say that, but I know in the kind of therapy I do, I would say, you've experienced something here that's been very meaningful to you, and there are people in the world that you can trust. Oh, no, they're not. There's nobody I can trust like you. Well, yes, there is. They're not a therapist. They might, also want something from you. They might be more of a give and take relationship, but you have to begin to, you don't have to, but it's good for you to begin to find those people that you can confide in and that you can trust. And as you gradually move toward that, the therapist can move back. So you can see how it's sort of a shifting. And with personality disorders, especially borderline personality disorder, this can take a long time. A lot of people with borderline personality have had a lot of trauma and abuse in their life. So this can take quite a while, but I think it is important that it happen, because, therapists get old, we have birthdays, we get old, we retire, we are sometimes disappointing. Sometimes people can get frustrated. They can either sense my frustration, or I usually, if I'm frustrated, try to say, I'm getting kind of frustrated because I don't know what else to say to you. I'm out of ideas. And I try to, I just say, I don't know what to do. And do you have any ideas? Because I'm running out of them. And just talk about it as honestly as I can in a non-judgmental way. So, but you can have sometimes rifts in therapy that I think are really good to talk about. I've had plenty of people say to me, that thing you said to me last week, that bothered me all week. And I even asked my friends about it and they said, oh, that's weird. And so, I say sometimes things that are off the cuff that are inappropriate. I say things that are wrong. I have an opinion that's wrong. Sometimes not. And just to come back to your therapist and say, I was mad at you, I was hurt by you, and to understand that, again, this therapeutic relationship is kind of a microcosm of what you want to try to achieve in your other relationships, where you have someone that hopefully will not get defensive and will say to you, I can understand that you're mad at me. I didn't think it was a very well put comment either. This is what I was feeling, and I did not say it very well, and I apologize to you. That is very healthy. And then sometimes, I remember when a therapist said something to me one time, and I walked out of the session. I got so mad. It was a comment about my mom, and I wasn't ready to hear it. And I was so protective of her. And so then I realized, well, I was the fool there. And I called them back and I apologized for leaving so hastily. And I said, I'm sorry. You've obviously touched a nerve and we definitely need to talk about this. But so that was, that was a lot. There was a lot of learning from me there. Good, Cheryl. I'm glad you needed this. Do you think therapy via phone Zoom is just as effective as in person? Great question, Suzanne. Well, I've been doing teletherapy since March, and I will tell you that and actually somewhat serendipitously, I guess, back in May or June, I was approached by BetterHelp for them to sponsor my podcast. That's not a lot of money there, but I do make some money on that. And I might have said no had I not had that 3 or 4 months under my belt of doing teletherapy myself, because this is what I found. I had to learn some new skills as a therapist. I had to learn about where I put my eyes. I had to learn how to read a little different body language. I couldn't count on as much. I usually can't see people's legs, for example. So I can't tell if they're, if their leg is shaking like this. I have to say, did I do something with their shoulders? I had to notice things that maybe I didn't notice as much or was more subtle. I had to change my energy. When I'm in the room with someone, I have a lot of, I don't know, there's just, there's just energy in the room. And that kind of energy does not happen for me over the screen. But if I put a little more energy in, I'm usually a little more laid back. But just like in this session, I'm putting a lot of energy into what I say. So I'm having to put more energy in it as a therapist. And if I do, I'm getting similar results to what I find in my own private practice. In fact, I've had people that have come in since March and have left and have told me, maybe they didn't. Well, these people have said, I really felt very helped. I felt very understood. Thank you very much. And so, is teletherapy for everybody? I've had one person in 8 months say, if I can't see you in person, then I don't want to come. Okay. And that's what they can do. So I think, yes, it does help. As far as BetterHelp is concerned, and I'm not selling BetterHelp, I don't make any money off of that from you. But I tried it out before I suggested it. I went on to BetterHelp as just someone seeking help. I do have panic disorder. So I talked about the last really bad panic attack I had, and I was open about it. And I actually told both therapists, Rachel, we're going to get to your question. I told both therapists at the end of the session that I was also a therapist and I had been given permission by BetterHelp. One of them thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And the other one got kind of mad about it, which I really, upon thinking about it, I understood. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I just thought I was really giving them a compliment because I thought both of them did a very good job, but maybe it came across kind of condescending. I didn't mean it to, but perhaps it did. Anyway, so I do think it's good. There's Talkspace, there's BetterHelp, there's several of them. And if you Google talk therapies or internet therapies or something like that, they rate them for you, and they tell them, just like if you were buying a car, they tell you what are good things about each one of them and what are not so good things about each one of them. All of them are licensed therapists. And not just they're not life coaches, which life coaches can be wonderful, but these are licensed therapists, which is a little different than a life coach. So yes, I am much more of an advocate for it. I will tell you, after the first 2 or 3 weeks of doing teletherapy, I was exhausted, much more tired than I was. And some of it was about learning a new skill, but it was a very difficult. I mean, it was a whole different energy set for me. Okay, Rachel, is there any way to distinguish between anxiety, lack of trust coming up from trauma versus my therapist has done something to violate my trust? Oh, okay. I have CPTSD and am working with a therapist trained in EMDR attachment theory and is psychodynamic. Interesting combination. I think we are working well together, but I had a terrible experience with my last therapist who I saw for 3 years. The relationship was great for a while, but ended horribly. I'm terrified of repeating that relationship. Okay. I'm sorry, first, that you had a terrible relationship. I think what I would do, I would talk about that fear very openly. And I would say, okay, this is what happened from my perspective with this last therapist. And can you give me your perspective on how the therapist might have felt? Or, of course, we're all different, very unique people, so they might not have a clue. But, maybe even talk to them about, there were some warning signs. There were some things that, I could tell were beginning to fall apart, and I didn't pay any attention to them. And I want to try to pay very much attention to those things here. And just y'all have an open conversation about it. I mean, I've worked with people who've been sexually abused by their former therapists. So anytime, for example, we get to where they might be, like, let's say I find out that they're going to some party. I mean, this is a small town I'm in, so I often see my patients outside of the therapy room. And I'll say, well, I think I'm going to that same party. I just want to give you a heads up. As soon as we start talking about those boundaries, I have to be very careful at that party that I do not have any kind of contact with that patient, because that she has already been violated as far as her boundaries are concerned. So I have to be very careful with my own with her. And even more careful than I typically am. So, how did you get hurt? You need to let your therapist know how you got hurt. And if you're trusting her or him, then hopefully y'all can have a really good discussion about what you both need to look for as far as your own sensitivities are concerned. Now, again, this does not mean that this is all you. I mean, just because you're the client doesn't mean that your therapist hasn't somehow triggered something in you that's really the therapist making a mistake. And that's a hard one to tease out. That's why I think you need to talk about it. And, a lot of people don't go to therapy because they think they're going to get labeled, I'm the one with the illness. And I'm sure there are some therapists who look at their patients like that, which makes me very, very sad, because I also have mental illness, and I try not to, I don't see patients that way. And so sometimes if you question whether the therapist is taking responsibility for what they may bring to the table, then maybe that's something you should pay attention to and talk about. You said this and I didn't like it, and you seemed to argue with me about it or something. So it is stressful to talk to your therapist about your relationship, just like if you have a good friend and y'all chitter chatter about different things, and all of a sudden something goes wrong in your relationship, and you can feel, your blood pressure go up and your heart starts racing and you get a little nervous about actually talking about your friendship, that can be very stressful, but it also can be one of the most healing things and actually lead to some movement in therapy that has not been happening before. Okay. You see, try what's up, mood, path, mood kit. Therapy is beneficial when you find the right therapist. It's worth it. Try listening to her podcast. Thank you very much. Try reading self-help books, journaling, and meditating. I'm not sure what the subject is, so I really can't comment on that. Thank you, though, for the heads up about the podcast. Michelle, is it okay to have a working relationship with a therapist after therapy is over? How long should a break in time be? Well, it's tricky, Michelle, because, again, that therapist knows a lot about you that you do not know about them. And so let's say you're on a committee together and she disagrees with you about something, or you disagree with her about something. Because she's your therapist, would you not say it? Or because she's your therapist, she wouldn't say it. I mean, I really, as far as psychologists are concerned, and I'm a clinical psychologist, I don't know what social workers or LPCs or life coaches, I don't know what their ethical standards say. I think our ethical standard is either 2 or 3 years before we have any type of relationship with a former client. Now, again, I live in a small town, and some of that has been, I haven't had a relationship with them, but I have been in their presence. And so for example, I was asked to join a book club several years ago, and 3 of the members, I had seen one of their daughters, and I had seen 2 of them many years prior to that, but I had seen them. So what I did before I accepted the invitation, I called all of them and said, listen, the therapeutic relationship is much more important than me being in a book club. And so I really want you to think about it, and I want you to tell me how you feel. And all 3 of them came back to me, I don't know, a day or so later, and said, I'm really comfortable. I might not come back to you as a therapist because obviously you're going to tell stuff about yourself that then you wouldn't be this, I mean, I'm transparent, but I would know more about you. And for example, when I started blogging, for example, and I would talk about struggling with empty nest, I had one person come in one time and say, well, I know you're really having a hard time about your son. I really kind of feel funny talking to you. And I looked at her and said, you've got to stop reading my blog, because that's getting in the way of our relationship. And so sometimes people can't distinguish between you as a person and you as a therapist. And so she did agree. She didn't read my blog anymore. Cherise, I'm struggling with bipolar and generalized anxiety disorder that must get worse due to the school suspension proceedings. Explain more about a local therapist and how many locations of this therapist. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'm sorry you're struggling, for one thing. I'm not sure what you mean as far as you're getting worse because of all the change that's going on, and maybe how to find a local therapist. Is that what you mean? And maybe where you can find them? Many people are in private practice. I volunteer at a free health clinic, for example. I haven't been during COVID, but I was there for 9 years, giving out free mental health services to people. You can find them there. You can find them in community clinics. They're usually in a little bit larger communities. There's a community psychological clinic that usually has sliding scale fees. There's graduate schools that have people who are getting trained to be therapists, who actually studies show are just as good as people who are have letters after their name already. Maybe because they're trying hard, maybe because they're getting supervision, whatever. So, there are lots of things you can do to find a therapist. You can talk to your OBGYN, you can talk to your primary care physician, you can talk to a friend, you can talk to a lawyer. You can try to ask around about, what kind of reputation does this person have? And you could look at their website. Gabrielle, does the label problem really come from the therapist side? I'm just curious. I never went to therapy nor studied in that field, but I'm wondering if outside factors may play a big role too, or even may it also be a more personal side. I think you mean, Gabriel, that people get labeled, oh, she's bipolar, or when I got rotator cuff surgery several years ago now, I heard some nurse say to some other nurse, the rotator cuff in bed 3. And the nurse came in and I said, I'm Margaret Rutherford. I'm not the rotator cuff in bed 3. And she giggled with me, luckily. But you don't want to be the bipolar person or the generalized anxiety disorder person. I don't think therapists do that too much. I mean, a lot of therapists get into being therapists because they also have had their own struggles and they understand how difficult it can be. But yes, our different places. When I moved here from Dallas, I was quite surprised in 1993 how much stigma still was alive and well in Arkansas. I didn't have a waiting room at the time, and I had some people say, you've got to get a waiting room because, it just doesn't feel private enough. And I understood that in many ways, but, I didn't have any money. So I just asked them to wait in their car until I could come get them, kind of, post-COVID stuff. But anyway, I do think sometimes that's more culturally induced. It's getting better. Slowly but surely it is getting better. Okay, well, when does it become an unhealthy dependency on your therapist? Yeah, Deborah, we talked about that. I think if you'll watch that again, um, if your therapist is the only person you are opening up to over a long period of time, that can be a problem. And I think a healthy therapist will try to say, okay, I need to help you find someone in your world that you can trust and develop this kind of relationship with, be it your partner or a friend or something where, but obviously the therapeutic relationship is a very special one. And so I remember when I moved from Dallas, I wasn't ready to leave my therapist. His name was Larry. And I said, I have to leave. And he said, Margaret, when you think, I'd worked for him about 2.5 years. And he said, when you think about me, do you know what I would say? If you ask me, question A, do you know what my response A would be? And I said, well, kind of, yeah. And he said, so you have internalized me. You have made our sessions something that you have internalized and brought inward. And so you know what I would say, and that is something that you can have. It's like when someone dies. I mean, as hard as it is, you can smile because you kind of know that they laugh at you, or they tease you, or they'd hold you, or they would, whatever the response might be, they would be kind or whatever. And so you can feel very loved by that. And I think that a close relationship with your therapist is good, except that you still want the whole goal of therapy, not the whole goal, but a very, very important goal of therapy is to create in that relationship something that the person values, that then they go and they create that in other relationships in their lives. You don't want to just, it's like any teacher. If you only know the stuff in the classroom and you can't apply it, then you're too dependent on the teacher. So you want to learn and risk and challenge and grow, and then take that growth into your real life. And that's what a healthy therapist will want you to do as well. So anyway, and I think sometimes it can get to be where you've really kind of done. I mean, there are times when I've had to say to people, I think I don't have any more to offer you, not in a like because you're being difficult kind of way or at all, but I think you're done. I think you're in a good spot, and we don't seem to be having things to work on. And I think you need to try your own wings, or somebody will say that to me themselves. They'll say, I think I'm ready to, I really haven't had much new to say, and I think it's good for me to go on and try this out for myself. And I'm like, yes, you go. If you need me, you can always come back. You can always come back for revamp or a kind of a refueling. And I have a lot of people use therapy like that, and I've used it that way myself. Thank you all so much for being here. Again, thanks for the happy birthday wishes. I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. You can reach me at the Self-Work Podcast on Apple Podcast. I'm now on Spotify. I'm on Amazon. I'm on new and Player FM. I'm on, it's everywhere. iHeartRadio. And of course, iTunes and all of that. And I love doing it. I've had almost 1.8 million downloads. So it's really I think it's an exciting podcast. I love getting so many listener emails, and I answer those emails every week. And I enjoy doing it. I'm having some wonderful guests on these days. My next guest is going to be Lewis Howes, who is just this, he gets 10 million podcast downloads a month. And I've gotten 1.8 in 4 years. So you can see he's very, very popular. And he had me on his podcast like last December, and he's kindly, and much sort of to my amazement, agreed to come on mine. He was sexually abused as a child, and that will be in November. So I would love to have you there. That's, again, the Self-Work Podcast. I do have a Facebook closed group at facebook.com/groups/self-work. My website is drmargaretrutherford.com. Oh, and my book. Forgot my book, Perfectly Hidden Depression. It's all about if you need a lot of control in your life, or you struggle with perfectionistic tendencies. You probably don't even think of yourself as a perfectionist, but you can't access painful emotions, or you know somebody who can't. Suicides are going up, perfectionism rates are going up, and I'm trying to reach people who definitely need to read this book. I had two women contact me in May. And one of them said one of her very good friends had died by suicide. She had this incredibly successful looking life, 3 children whom she adored, a husband that they, of course, had their problems, but they were good. And she died by suicide. And they found my book on her nightstand, which just crushed me at the time. We've since done a workshop in her honor. And so if you can find the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, it's very much like the way I do therapy. In fact, there are over 60 exercises in it that I do with almost every patient, not like lockstep, but I pull from those exercises to help people move through their problems. And I would love to offer that to you. It's not expensive. It's offered in paperback, in ebook, and in audiobook. All right. So I will be back. As my grandmother used to say, God willing, the creek don't rise. I will be back in November on the 3rd Wednesday at 3 o'clock Central Standard Time, and I'd love to have you there. Thank you so much. Thanks, Camera, for being here from the Mighty, and thank you all. See you in November. Take care, and please be safe. Stay healthy. Let's see, it looks like maybe Camera hasn't, it's not stopping the show. I don't think I have to. Well, this is confusing. Maybe I do. Nope, no chat.